Hello, good evening all of you. I am Nishant and welcome to a new episode of Arguably the Reading Quest. So today I am going to talk about a book in details, that is The Conquest of Happiness by none other than Bertrand Russell. So Russell was, as I've already told you, a mathematician who wrote volumes of books on philosophy and has been awarded a Nobel Prize in Literature. Conquest of Happiness is one of my favorite books. So to start with, the book is divided into, and please watch the video till end because this is going to be a rather long video wherein I will quote Russell and let Russell speak for himself. Okay, rather than I explaining him. So the book is divided into two parts. One is the causes of unhappiness and the second part is the causes of happiness. So causes of unhappiness, that is part 1, is divided into 9 chapters. That is what makes people unhappy, Byronic unhappiness, competition, boredom and excitement, fatigue, envy, sense of sin, persecution mania, and fear of public opinion. In which I will speak on 3 topics, that is what makes people unhappy, competition, and boredom and excitement in details. The second part is causes of happiness, which is happiness still possible, jest, affection, the family, work, impersonal interests, effort and resignation, and the happy man. So this is what A.C. Grayling writes in the preface to the Rutledge Classic edition. So this is from the Rutledge Classic. And A.C. Grayling introduces Russell's work, that is The Conquest of Happiness that we are talking about. In the early part of his long career, in fact, until his mid-40s, Russell believed that philosophy was strictly a technical subject, in fact, a branch of logic, which had nothing to do with the matters of ordinary life. He still held this view during the time when he lived and taught in Peking, China, in the early 1920s, which meant that he lost an opportunity to help the young Chinese intellectuals who asked him for guidance in matters social and political, which they much needed at that tumultuous period of their country's history. At the same time, the American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey was in China at that time, and he did not hesitate to respond to such requests, with the result that he is remembered today in China with some reverence, whereas Russell left scarcely any mark outside Peking University. But Russell's austere technical view of philosophy did not last much longer. His reputation as a philosopher prompted people to ask him for his opinion on every imaginable subject. And when he found it convenient to write non-technical books and articles as a way of making money, remember he was expelled from Cambridge as well for his championing of the freedom of thought, sexual freedom and vociferous pacifism. Right, so he was expelled. So undoubtedly he had to write, he was compelled to write, articles to popularize philosophy and science as a way of making money. And then he found a readership, eagerly waiting to know what a philosopher had in store when he has to speak of or on happiness. Right. Then in the same book, A.C. Grayling says that because Russell speaks so eloquently for himself, it is unnecessary to provide an interpretation here of what he says in The Conquest of Happiness. And also I am not going to provide you any interpretation. I am just going to quote some of the excerpts from the book directly and let Russell himself do the talking. To get an overview of the book, simply look at the chapter's heading, which I have already told you. They convey Russell's fundamental message, for which he claims no originality, of course, but every support from the experience of mankind that happiness is gained by being outward looking in work and relationship, and lost by being wrapped up in oneself, dwelling on anxieties and fear. There will always be cynics. You know who is a cynic? Cynic, as Oscar Wilde says, that one who knows the price of everything and value of nothing is a cynic. Right. So there will always be cynics to say that we need no ghost from the grave to tell us that happiness is a result of active outward engagement with life and the world. But since this is a truth, and one that makes a great difference to anyone who will accept and apply it, I think it is worth attending to, especially in Russell's elegant, witty and educative statement of it, which adds to its force and thereby helps us remember it in the face of all pressure to do otherwise, says A.C. Grayling, who is again a modern day famous philosopher who is very famously read for his book History of Philosophy. Now, Russell speaks for himself in the preface, the prolegomena to this book, Conquest of Happiness, that this book is not addressed to the learned or to those who regard a practical problem merely as something to be talked about. No profound philosophy or deep erudition is to be found in the following pages. I have aimed only at putting together some remarks which are inspired by what I hope is common sense. All that I claim for the recipes offered to the reader is that they are such as confirmed by my own experience and observation, and that they have increased my own happiness wherever I have acted in accordance with them. On this ground, I venture to hope that some among those multitudes of men and women who suffer unhappiness without enjoying it, you see there's a sarcasm here, who suffer unhappiness without enjoying it, may find their situation diagnosed and a method of escape suggested. It is in the belief that many people who are unhappy could become happy by well-directed effort that I have written this book. Now, the first chapter itself is very interesting, and I quote directly that what makes people unhappy? Animals are happy, says Russell, so long as they have health and enough to eat. Human beings, one feel, ought to be, but in the modern world they are not, at least in the great majority of cases. If you are unhappy yourself, you will probably be prepared to admit that you are not exceptional in this. Though the kinds are different, you will find that unhappiness meets you everywhere. Let us suppose that you are in New York, the most typically modern of great cities. Stand in a busy street during working hour, or on a main thoroughfare on a weekend, or at a dance of an evening. Empty your mind of your own ego and let your personalities of the strangers about you take possession of you one after the another. You will find that each of these different crowds has its own troubles. In the work hour crowd, you will see anxiety, excessive concentration, dyspepsia, lack of interest in anything but the struggle, incapacity for play, unconsciousness of their fellow creatures. On the main road at the weekend, you will see men and women all comfortably off and some very rich engaged in the pursuit of pleasure. Or again, watch people at a gay evening, happy evening. All come determined to be happy with a kind of grim resolve with which one determines not to make a fuss at the dentist's. It is held that drink and petting are the gateways to joy, so people get drunk publicly and quickly, and try not to notice how much their partners disgust them. After a sufficient amount of drink, men begin to weep. So that is the case everywhere you see. Today nothing has changed, right? I am surprised that Russell didn't add that they began to weep and then the very next thing they do is to call their exes. Had he lived for another year, he would have seen that. And to lament how unworthy they are. Morally of the devotion of their mothers. All that alcohol does for them is to liberate the sense of sin which reason suppresses in saner moments. The cause of these various kind of unhappinesses lie partly in the social system, partly in individual psychology, which of course is itself too a considerable product of the social system. I have written before the changes in the social system required to promote happiness. Concerning the abolition of war, of economic exploitation, of education in cruelty and fear, it is not my intention to speak in this volume of any of those topics. So this volume is more about how to, achieve happiness for ourselves, considering all the, outwardly situation remaining the same. Now here comes a very thrilling example from his own autobiography. Perhaps the best introduction to philosophy which I wish to advocate will be a few words of autobiography. I was not born happy. As a child, my favorite hymn was, weary of earth and laden with my sin. At the age of 5, I reflected that if I should live to be 70, at the age of 5 he reflected, that's a very improbable thing for me to think that a child at the age of 5 can reflect on that what would happen if he would be living till 70. I had only endured so far a 14th part of my whole life, and I felt the long spread out boredom ahead of me to be almost unendurable. In adolescence, I hated life and I was continually on the verge of suicide, from which, however, I was restrained by the desire to know more mathematics. Now, on the contrary, I enjoy life. I might almost say that with every year that passes, I enjoy it more. This is due partly to having discovered what were the things that I most desired and having gradually acquired many of these. Partly is due to having successfully dismissed certain object of desire, as essentially unattainable. So this was from the first chapter, that what makes people unhappy. I continue from the first chapter itself. Narcissism is in a sense the converse of a habitual sense of sin. It consists in the habit of admiring oneself and wishing to be admired. Up to a point, it is of course normal and not to be deplored. It is only in its excesses that it becomes a grave evil. In many women, especially rich society women, the capacity for feeling love is completely dried up and is replaced by a powerful desire that all men should love them. When a woman of this kind is sure that a man loves her, she has no further use of him. The same thing occurs with men. When vanity is carried to this height, there is no genuine interest in any other person and therefore no real satisfaction to be obtained from love. Other interests fail even more disastrously. A narcissist, for example, inspired by the homage paid to great painters, may become an art student. But as painting is for him a mere mean to an end, the technique never becomes interesting. And the technique is important, the journey is important, the process is important. And no subject can be seen except in relation to self. The result is failure and disappointment. And consequently, the man whose sole concern with the world is that it shall admire him is not likely to achieve his object. But even if he does, he will not be completely happy, since human instinct is never completely centered, and the narcissist is limiting himself artificially just as truly as is the man dominated by a sense of sin. The primitive man might be proud of being a good hunter, but he also enjoyed the activity of the chase, chasing a wild beast to death. Please mind it. Vanity, when it passes beyond a point, kills pleasure in every activity of its own shake. The megalomaniac differs. There's a very beautiful quote here, you see, and every line is full of nuggets of wisdom. Not only quotes, but nuggets of wisdom. The megalomaniac differs from the narcissist by the fact that he wishes to be powerful rather than charming, and seeks to be feared rather than loved. To this type belong many lunatics and most of the great men in history. Love of power, like vanity, is a strong element in normal human nature, and as such it is to be accepted. There is no doubt about it. There is no harm in that. It becomes deplorable only when it is excessive or associated with an insufficient sense of reality. When this occurs, it makes a man unhappy or foolish, if not both. The lunatic who thinks he is a crowned head prince may be in a sense happy, but his happiness is not of a kind that any sane person would envy. This is, why you should read Russell, because he has an impeccable sense of history. Now you see, he quotes one famous king from history, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was psychologically of the same type as the lunatic, though he possessed the talent to achieve the lunatic's dream. He could not, however, achieve his own dream, which enlarged its scope as his achievement grew. When it became clear that he was the greatest conqueror known to fame, he decided that he was God. Was he a happy man? His drunkenness, his furious rages, his indifference to women, and his claim to divinity suggest that he was not. There is no ultimate satisfaction in the cultivation of one element of human nature at the expense of all the others, nor in viewing all the world as raw material for the magnificence of one's own ego. Usually the megalomaniac, whether insane or normally sane, is the product of some excessive humiliation. Napoleon suffered at school from inferiority of his school fellowmen, who were rich aristocrats, while he was a penurious scholarship boy. Now in chapter 3, in competition, Rachel's right, the struggle for life is a thing which does of course occur. And if you ask an American or any man in business in England, that what it is that most interferes with his enjoyment of existence, he will say the struggle for life. Okay. Now, not that it is not what the businessman means when he speaks of the struggle for life. It is an inaccurate phrase which he has picked up in order to give dignity to something essentially trivial. What people mean therefore by the struggle for life is really the struggle for success. What people fear when they engage in the struggle is not that they will fail to get their breakfast next morning, but that they will fail to outshine their neighbors next morning. Consider the life of such a man. He has, we may suppose, a charming house, a charming wife, and charming children. He wakes up early in the morning while they are still asleep and hurries off to his office. There it is his duty to display the qualities of a great executive. He cultivates a firm jaw, a decisive manner of speech, and an air of sagacious reserve calculated to impress everybody except the office boy. He dictates letters, converses with a various important person on phone, studies the market, and presently has lunch with some person with whom he is conducting or hoping to conduct a deal. The same sort of things goes on all the afternoon. He arrives home tired, just in time to dress for dinner. The walking life of this man has the psychology of 100 yards race, but as the race upon which he is engaged is one whose only goal is the grave, the concentration, which is appropriate enough for 100 yards, becomes in the end somewhat excessive. What does he know about his children? On weekday he is in the office, on Sunday he is at the golf link. What does he know about his wife? Okay. Of springtime and harvest he knows only as they affect the market. Foreign countries as he has probably seen, but with the eyes of utter boredom. Books seem to him even futile, and music highbrow. Years by years he grows more lonely, his attention grows more concentrated, and his life outside business more desiccated. I have seen the American of this type in later middle life, in Europe with his wife and his daughters. And then Russell writes, the trouble arises from generally received philosophy of life, according to which life is a contest, a competition in which respect is to be accorded to the victors. This view leads to an undue cultivation of the will at the expense of the senses and the intellect. Then, in Boredom and Excitement, Russell writes, boredom as a factor in human behavior has received, in my opinion, far less attention than it deserves. It has been, I believe, one of the greatest motive powers throughout the historical epoch, and is so at the present day more than ever. Boredom would seem to be a distinctively human emotion. Animals in captivity, it is true, become listless, pace up and down and yawn, but in a state of nature I do not believe that they experience anything analogous to boredom as we human beings do. The capacity to endure a more or less monotonous life is one which should be acquired in childhood. Modern parents are greatly to blame in this respect. They provide their children with far too many passive amusements, such as shows and good things to eat, and do not realize the importance to a child of having one day like another, except of course for somewhat rare occasions. The pleasure of childhood should be in the main be such as the child extracts from his environment by the means of some effort, inventiveness and playfulness. But constructive purposes do not easily form themselves in a boy's mind if he is living a life of distractions and dissipations, for in that case his thoughts will always be directed toward the next pleasure rather than toward the distant achievement. And then comes a line of profound wisdom, as Russell says, for all these reasons a generation that cannot endure boredom will be a generation of little men, of men unduly divorced from the slow processes of nature, of men in whom every vital impulse slowly withers as though they were cut flowers in a vase. You see, that is why it is important to experience boredom as well. Then, at the end of this chapter, Russell writes, a special kind of boredom from which modern urban populations suffer is intimately bound up with their separation from the life of earth. A happy life must be to a great extent a quiet life, for it is only in an atmosphere of quiet that true joy dares live. Then in the part 2, the causes of happiness. Is happiness still possible? He writes, so far we have been considering the unhappy man. We now have the pleasanter task of considering the happy man. From the conversations and the books of some of my friends, I have been almost led to conclude that happiness in modern world has become an impossibility. I find, however, that this view tends to be dissipated by introspection, foreign travels, and the conversation with my gardener. In the end chapter, Russell writes, the secret of happiness is this. Let your interests be as wide as possible, and let your reactions to the things and persons that interest you be as far as possible friendly rather than hostile. The preliminary survey of the possibilities of happiness will be expanded in subsequent chapters, he says, together with suggestions as to ways of escaping from psychological sources of misery. And then in the next chapter, that is chapter number 11, titled Zest, Z-E-S-T, Zest. In this chapter, I propose to deal with what seemed to me the most universal and the distinctive mark of happy men, namely zest. Perhaps the best way to understand what is meant by zest will be to consider the different ways in which men behave when they sit down to a meal. Now you see the insights given by Russell. There are those to whom a meal is merely a bore. No matter how excellent the food may be, they felt that it is uninteresting. They have had excellent food before, probably at almost every meal they have eaten. They have never known what it was to go without a meal until hunger became a raging passion, but have come to regard meals as merely conventional occurrences dictated by the fashions of the society in which they live in. Like everything else, meals are tiresome. But it is no use to make a fuss because nothing else will be less tiresome. Then there are the invalids who are in the vegetative state because of some disease and all that. Okay, who eat from a sense of duty because the doctor has told them that it is necessary to take a little nourishment in order to keep up their strength. Then there are the epicures who start hopefully but find that nothing has been quite so well cooked as it ought to have been. Then there are the gourmetizers who fall upon their food with eager rapacity, eat too much, glow plethoric and clumsy. Finally, there are those who begin with a sound appetite, are glad of their food, eat until they have had enough and then stop. Those who are set down before the feast of life have similar attitude towards the good things which it has to offer. The happy man corresponds to the last of our eaters, the one who eat with jest. What hunger is in relation to food, jest is in relation to life. I again repeat, what hunger is in relation to food, jest is in relation to life. Please ponder on this quote. Suppose one man likes strawberries, another doesn't. In what respect is the later superior? There is no abstract or impersonal proof either that strawberries are good or that they are not good. To the man who likes them, they are good. To the man who dislikes them, they are not good. But the man who likes them has a pleasure which the other does not have. To that extent, his life is more enjoyable and he is better adapted to the world in which both must live. What is true in this trivial instance is equally true in more important matters. The man who enjoys watching football is to that extent superior to the man who does not. The man who enjoys reading is more superior to the man who does not, since the opportunities for reading are more frequent than the opportunities for watching football. You see, these are the kind of arguments that Russell puts forward from day-to-day life. The more things a man is interested in, the more opportunities of happiness he has, and the less he is at the mercy of fate. Since if he loses one thing, he can fall back upon another. Life is too short to be interested in everything, but it is too good to be interested in as many things as are necessary to fill our days. Then in impersonal interests, Russell writes, in this chapter I wish to consider not those major interests about which a man's life is built, but those minor interests which fill his leisure and afford relaxation from the tenseness of his more serious preoccupations. A man who has once perceived, however temporarily and however briefly, what makes greatness of soul can no longer be happy if he allows himself to be petty, self-seeking, troubled by trivial misfortunes, dreading what fate may have in store for him. The man capable of greatness of soul will open wide the windows of his mind, letting the winds blow freely upon it from every portion of the universe. He will see himself and life and the world as truly as our human limitations will permit. Realizing the brevity and minuteness of human life, he will realize also that in individual minds is concentrated whatever of value the known universe contains. And he will see that the man whose mind mirrors the world becomes in a sense as great as the world. In emancipation from the fears that beset the slave of circumstances, he will experience a profound joy. And through all the vicissitudes of his outward life, he will remain in the depth of his being a happy man. So this is all for this video, guys. I hope I have given you a glimpse of what to expect in The Conquest of Happiness by Bertrand. If you have still not liked, shared and subscribed my video, please do that. Please spread the word. Please do comment on the video and tell me which video would you like me to make next. Thank you all of you. Happy reading.